Hello students, I am Raghavan Kumar Singh, faculty of US Academy and Institute. We will discuss class 9th history second chapter, Socialism in Europe and Russian Revolution. In this chapter, we will talk about the emergence of socialism in Europe. The revolution changes society differently and raise the questions of economic equality and the well-being of worker and peasants, including topics such as changes initiation by the Soviet government, industrialization and mechanization of agriculture, rights of citizens. Now start the chapter from the topic the age of social changes. After the revolution, individual rights and social power began to be discussed in many parts of the world, including Europe and Asia. Colonial development reshaped ideas of social or societal changes, but everyone was not in favor of the complete transformation of the society. Through the revolution in Russia, socialism became one of the most significant and powerful ideas to shape society in the 20th century. Liberal, radical, and conservatives. Liberals wanted a nation which tolerated all religion. They opposes uncontrolled power of dynastic rules and argued for a representative elected permanently or parliamentary government, subject to laws interpreted by a well-trained judiciary that was independent of rulers and officials. They wanted a government based on the majority of a country population, conservatives. After the 19th century, accepted changes but also believed the past needed to be respected and changed and begin slowly. Industrial society and social changes. Industrial revolution led to changes in social and economical life. New regions developed, new cities came up, and new industrialized sectors were developed. Men, women, and children came to factories in search of work. But unfortunately, working hours were long and wages were low. There were unemployment during the time of low demand for industrial goods. Liberals and radicals made wealth through trade or industrial ventures. According to them, society can be developed if freedom of individual was ensured, if the poor could labor, and those was with capital could operate without restraint. In France, Italy, Germany, and Russia, revolutionaries overthrew existing monarchies. Nationalists talked of revolution to create nation with equal rights. The coming of socialism in Europe. Socialism was a well-known body of idea by the mid 19th century in Europe. Socialists were against private property and saw it as the root of all social ills of the time. They wanted to change it and campaigned for it. Robert Owen, from 1771 to 1858, sought to build a cooperative community called New Harmony in Indiana, USA. Louis Blanc, 1813 to 1882, wanted the government to encourage cooperatives and replace capitalist enterprises. Karl Marx, 1818 to 1883, and Frederick Engels, 1820 to 1895, added other ideas of this body of argument. According to Marx, industrial society was capitalist who owned the capital invested in factories, and the profit of capitalist was produced by workers. Capitalism and the rule of private property were overthrown. Marx believed that a communist society was the natural society of the future. Support for socialism. In the 1870s, socialist ideas spread through Europe and they formed an international body, namely the Second International. Associations were formed by workers in Germany and England to fight for better living and working conditions. The Labour Party and Socialist Party were formed by socialists and trade unionists by 1905. The Russian Revolution. In the October Revolution of 1917, socialists took over the government in Russia. The fall of monarchy in February 1917 and the event of October were termed as the Russian Revolution. The Russian Empire in 1914, Russia was ruled by Tsar Nicholas II and its empire. The Russian Empire included current-day Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, parts of Poland, Ukraine, and Belarus, stretching to the Pacific and comprised today current or Central Asian states, as well as Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. Majority of the population was Russian Orthodox Christianity. Economy and society. At the beginning of the 20th century, Russian population was dominated by agriculturalists who used to cultivate for the market as well as for their own needs. St. Petersburg and Moscow were prominent industrial areas. Craftsmen undertook much of the production, but large factories existed alongside with workshops. In the 1890s, more factories were set up after and foreign investment in industry increased. Large factories were supervised by the government to ensure minimum wages and a limited hour of work. Workers were a divided social group. They were also divided by their skills. Despite division, workers united to stop work when they disagree with the employers about dismissal or work conditions. Peasants cultivated most of the lands, but the nobility, the crown, and the Orthodox Church owned large properties. Nobles got power and position through their services to the Tsar. In Russia, peasants wanted the land of the nobles. Now, socialism in Russia. Political parties in Russia were legal before 1914. In 1898, socialists founded the Russian Social Democratic Workers' Party, who respected Marx's ideas. Some Russian socialists felt that the peasants' custom of dividing lands periodically made them natural socialists. Throughout the 19th century, socialists were active in the countryside and formed the Socialist Revolutionary Party in 19th century. The party struggled for peasants' right and demand land belonging to nobles be transferred to peasants. The party was divided over the strategy of organization. According to Vladimir Lenin, in a repressive society like Tsarist Russia, the party should be declined and should control the number and quality of its members. Mensvik thought that the party should be open to all. The turbulent time, the 1905 revolution. Russia was an autocracy, and even at the beginning of the 20th century, the Tsar was not subject to parliament. During the revolution of 1905, Russia, along with the Social Democrat and Socialist revolutionaries, worked with peasants and workers to demand a constitution. For Russian workers, bad times started from the year 1904, as prices of essential goods rose and their real wages declined by 20%. Workers went on strike, demanding a reduction in the working day to 8 hours, an increase in wages, and improvement in working conditions. The procession was attacked by the police and the Cossack when it reached the Winter Palace. The incident, known as Bloody Sunday, started a series of events which resulted in the 1905 revolution. During the 1905 revolution, the Tsar allowed the creation of an elected consultative parliament or Duma. After 1905, most committees and unions worked unofficially since they were declared illegal. The First World War and the Russian Empire. In 1914, war broke out between two European alliances, Germany, Austria, and Turkey, the Central Power, and France, Britain, and Russia, later Italy and Romania. This was the First World War. The war became popular, and as it continued, the Tsar refused to consult the main parties in the Duma. Support war parties thin. The First World War was different on the East Front and on the Western Front. Between 1914 and 1916, Russian army lost badly in Germany and Austria. Russian army destroyed crops and buildings to prevent the enemy from being able to live off the land. The country was cut off from other suppliers of industrial goods by general control of the Baltic Sea. Railway lines began to break down by 1916 for the peoples in the cities. Bread and flour became scarce. By the winter of 1916, riots at bread shops were common. The February Revolution and Petrograd. Petrograd city is divided among its people on the right bank of the river Neva. Workers' quarter and factories located fashionable areas such as the Winter Palace and official buildings. Food shortages deeply affected the workers' quarter. On the right bank, a factory was shut down on February 22nd. Women also led the way to strike, and it is called International Women's Day. The government imposed a curfew as the fashionable quarter and official buildings were surrounded by workers. Duma was suspended on 25th February. The streets thronged with the demonstrators raising a slogan about bread, wages, better hours, and democracy. The government called out the cavalry, but they refused to fire on the demonstrators. Soldiers and striking workers gathered to form a Soviet or council in the same building as the Duma met, and it is termed as the Petrograd Soviet. Soviet leader and Duma leaders formed a provisional government to run the country. Russia's future and be decided by a constituent assembly elected on the basis of universal adult suffrage. Petrograd had led the February Revolution that brought down the monarchy in February 1917. After February, under the provincial or the provisional government, army officials, landowners, and industrialists were influential. Liberals and socialists worked together and elected government. Restriction on public meetings and association were removed. In April 1917, the Bolshevik leader Vladimir Lenin returned to Russia from his exile. Lenin demanded three things and termed as April thesis. He wanted war to end, land to be transferred to the peasants, and bank to be nationalized. He also emphasized on renaming the Bolshevik Party of the Communist Party to the Communist Party. Workers' movement spread throughout the summer. Factory committees formed and trade unions grew in numbers. When the provisional government saw its power reduces and Bolshevik influence grew, they decided to take a stand measure against the spreading discontent. In the countryside, peasants and their socialist revolutionary leaders pressed for the redistribution of lands. Encouraged by the socialist revolutionaries, peasants seized land between July and September 1917. The Revolution of October 1917. The conflict between the provisional government and the Bolshevik grew on 16th October 1917. Lenin persuaded the Petrograd Soviet and the Bolshevik Party to agree to a socialist seizure of power. To organize the seizure, a military revolutionary committee was appointed by the Soviet under Leon Trotsky. The military revolutionary committee ordered its supporters to seize government offices and arrest ministers. By nightfall, the city was under the committee controlled and the ministers had surrendered. At a meeting of the All-Russian Congress of Soviets in Petrograd, the majority approved the Bolshevik action. What changed after October? Industry and banks were nationalized in November 1917, which means that the government took over ownership and management. Land was declared, and social property and peasants were allowed to seize the land of the nobility. The Bolshevik Party was renamed the Russian Communist Party. Bolshevik. Elections were conducted in November 1917 to the Constitutional or the Constituent Assembly, but they failed in majority. In January 1918, the Assembly rejected Bolshevik measure and Lenin dismissed the Assembly. Despite opposition in March 1918, the Bolshevik made peace with Germany. At Brest-Litovsk, the Bolshevik participated in the election to the All-Russian Congress of Soviet, which became the parliament of the country. Russia became a one-party state. After October 1917, this led to experiment in the art of architecture, but many became disillusioned because of the censorship the party encouraged. The Civil War. The Russian army broke up and their leaders moved to South Russia and organized troops to fight the Bolshevik, means the Reds. During 1918 and 1919, the Russian Empire was controlled by the Greens, means the socialist revolutionaries, and Whites, means pro-Tsarist, backed by French American, British and Japanese troops. These troops and the Bolshevik fought a civil war. By January 1920, the Bolshevik controlled most of the former Russian Empire in the name of defending socialism. Bolshevik colonists brutally massacred local nationalists. Most non-Russian nationalists were given political autonomy in the Soviet Union, means USSR, the state the Bolshevik created from the Russian Empire in December 1922. Now making a socialist society. During the Civil War, industries and banks kept nationalized. Peasants were permitted to cultivate the lands. Centralized planning process were introduced. Officials worked on how the economy will work and set targets for a 5-year period. During the first two plans, the government fixed all prices to promote industrial growth. 19 1927 to 1932 and 1933 to 1938. Centralized planning led to economical growth, but rapid construction led to poor working conditions. A schooling system developed and arrangements were made for factory workers and peasants to enter universities. For women workers, creches were established in factories for the children. Cheap public health care were provided. Model living quarters were set up for workers. Stalinism and collectivization. The period of the early planned economy led to disaster of the collectivization of agriculture, means collection of agriculture. By 1927-1928, the town in Soviet Russia faced an acute problem of grain supply. Stalin introduced firm emergency measures. In 1928, party members toured the grain producing areas, supervising enforced grains collections and raiding kulaks, the name for well-to-do peasants. After 1917, land had been given over to peasants. For 1929, the party forced all peasants to cultivate in collective farms named kolkhos. Peasants worked on the lands and the kolkhos profit was shared. Between 1929 and 1931, the number of cattle fell by one-third. The government of Stalin allowed some independent cultivation but treated such cultivators unsympathetically. In spite of collectivization, production did not increase immediately, and due to bad harvest of 1930 to 1933, over 4 million people died throughout the country. Accusations were made, and by 1939, over 2 million were in prison or labor camps. The global influence of the Russian Revolution and the USSR. In many countries, communist parties were formed, like the Communist Party of Great Britain. Non-Russian from outside the USSR participate in the Conference of the Peoples of the East, 1920. The Bolshevik founded Comintern, an international union of pro-Bolshevik socialist parties. Before the outbreak of the Second World War, the USSR had given socialism a global face and world stature. The USSR became a great power and its industries and agriculture and developed, and the poor were being fed. By the end of the 20th century, the international reputation of the USSR as a socialist country had declined.